journalism in the classroom.
Yeah, thank you very much for having me. It's a great honor and pleasure being with you at the District Press event in Berlin, and I'm happy that actually Reporters Without Borders has been mentioned already this morning, and I think that I'm really happy because for us as a global human rights organization defending the right to press freedom, it's really vital and crucial actually to highlight the link between the right to freedom of the press and economic freedom, because we very often see that there are linkages, and that I think we as an organization, as Reporters Without Borders, have to face it. We're trying to face it, and I'm happy that Jim actually mentioned already our World Press Freedom Index and the questionnaire, because in our questionnaire, which actually lays the basis for our World Press Freedom Index, there's an important part actually on economic issues of press freedom. It's not only about individual people. I don't want to go into the details of our World Press Freedom Index now, but because I think some of you know and it has been mentioned already. Reporters Without Borders, we are seeing the linkage between press freedom and economic freedom, but in the very heart of our organization, we care about individual journalists who get into trouble. And just to give you some figures from last year, 80 journalists all over the world, according to our numbers, have been killed, and by the end of last year, almost 350 journalists all over the world have been detained by the end of the year. I just want to show you
Quand je
this little
serai
video.
grand, je me ferai tabasser par l'armée.
Da grande sarò minacciata di morte.
Когда я вырасту, мне выстрелят в спину.
راح أموت بالتأنيس.
Voy a ser torturada a muerte.
我将会坐11年的监狱。
Beni ömür boyu hapiste tehdit edecekler.
And I just wanted to show you this video, and I think this fits very much to the presentation, to both of the presentations, which we listened to before, because we heard about changing business model, changing media landscapes, and that media distribution has to find for new ways how to actually change its business model. But I think all of you being here, I think you believe in the future of media distribution, in the future of journalism as such. And this little video, I think it shows you a bit that we have to take care about the future, and we believe in the future of journalism. Of course, Reporters Without Borders does campaigning, does advocacy, and I don't want to go into all the details, but what very often I have the impression is, here, I skip this because I was asked to shorten a bit up. So, So, what we as an organization, I think, is we talk about individual journalists, as I did in the very beginning, but for organizing journalism, you need infrastructure, and I think it's important that an organization like Reporters Without Borders and District Press work together, and that's why we decided actually to launch a report, and I'm happy to launch this report today, and a report that newspapers that never arrive, and because we think that sometimes this part of press freedom and this infrastructural part in the public perception is sometimes underestimated. We think that until it reaches the hand, and I don't have to tell you of the readers, a newspaper continues to be vulnerable. If a journalistic investigation has not been prevented or a journalist silenced, information can be blocked during the dissemination process. And printers, distributors, and retailers are essential links in the long and complex distribution chain. Without them, citizens cannot access to diverse sources of information essential to any democracy. And I don't have to tell you, I think the print media distribution basically contains three main stages, and in these three main stages, they are all these offer opportunities to intervene, to basically to sender on the printing level, on the printing stage, on the transport stage, and the sales stage. And I just want to dig a bit deeper into these, into the forms of intervention on these three stages of newspaper distribution, and I want to do this by explaining you some examples from this report, which we are launching today here on the occasion of the DistriPress event in Berlin. What we see is actually on the printing stage, printing presses are really exposed to every kind of danger. I want to give you one example from Sudan. Sudan is actually the #1 country in seizing papers as they come directly off the press. In 30 years, the National Intelligence and Security Service has seized hundreds of times newspapers issues as they come off the press. Even now we observe some changes in Sudan, and we're looking forward how this will affect actually these levels of intervention. The second example, how actually the printing stage, a level of intervention can be, is from Gabon. In Gabon, their infiltrated technicians substituted all newspapers' content. I think that's really an unbelievable example. One morning, I want to give this example from La Loupe, which is a weekly known to be critical of President Ali Bongo's government, discovered a highly unusual issue in its content, which some journalists the other day prepared, praised the president and his aides to the skies. So something happened over the night, and this happened on the level of printing. And a third example I want to give you from Egypt, which we are documenting in our report. It's blackmailing in Egypt. If an unwanted article or investigation is not dropped, the all newspapers print version will not be printed by the state printing company, and this happens regularly. The second level of intervention is actually the transport stage, and there are really many pitfalls of print media delivery which we observed. And again, some country examples on this transport level. What we observed actually in Nigeria, Kashmir of Pakistan, we see in several countries, newspapers delivery trucks very often chased by police are stopped at military checkpoints to seize papers coming off the press. In Nigeria, Kashmir or Pakistan, governments do not hesitate to use important means to impede papers to reach their destinations. Another example on this stage is actually Kosovo. In Kosovo, after a sudden increase of import duty by 100%, on all Serbian products, including newspapers, it took only a few days to make disappear all the Serbian language newspapers and magazines at Kosovar newsstands. And even some borders cannot be crossed for some newspapers. Deemed to be blasphemous against Islam, the satirical weekly Charlie Hebdo, which for sure you know is no longer found in the Muslim world since 2015 to avoid causing shock and provoking serious incidents. And regarding satirical magazines, we have found out many other examples which are not allowed to cross borders, which brings me actually to the third stage of intervention, or the third level of third state of media distribution where intervention is possible, and this is actually the sales part. What we very often see, we can see a sweet way, a strong way, and a radical way on how to intervene at the sales part. The sweet way is just buying up. One example from Madagascar last year, early morning on September 18th in Madagascar, the bi-weekly paper Telenohorefi quickly disappeared from all newsstands, but it was not bought by the usual readers. All available copies, which claimed on front page that the First Lady had an affair with her husband advisor, were bought as discreetly as possible by government representatives. This is a more sweet way because it's not that visible. The stronger way is actually just confiscating and burning. One example is from Equatorial Guinea on August 1st, 2017, 1.5 years ago. All copies of the pro-government weekly Ebano were withdrawn from sale and burned. The paper made the mistake to publish an ITW with a journalist to criticize the regime's harassment of the media. And an even more radical way is really firing and murder. One example from a country very close is coming from France. In France, the images of a burning newspapers kiosk along Paris' famous Champs-Élysées Avenue on March 16th of this year went around the world, triggering outrage. In total, a dozen of kiosks have been burned or seriously damaged in the course of the violence that marked this. The 18th week of Gilets jaunes, so the Yellow Vest protests, no one claimed responsibility for the torching of the newspaper kiosk in Paris, but these acts of vandalism, public attacks on symbols of press freedom and free speech came at the time when an anti-media climate had taken hold in France. And a third example of intervention on this level of sale is coming from Mexico, a country which is basically by us every year named as the most deadliest country for journalists, but it can be dangerous for news vendors as well. In Mexico, news vendors are called voceadores, which is actually a reference to the fact that they use their voices to announce the headlines of the newspapers they sell. But in this country, it can be a risky business because it's a country which is really the most dangerous, as I said. And one of these news vendors just a year ago had been killed as he was announcing the arrest of a group of alleged motorcycle thieves. The killer shot the victim just because he didn't like the article. And these are just country examples, but in our report we try to shed a light as well a bit on the broader picture, and I want to give you some figures. We questioned journalists and print media distributors in more than 90 countries all over the world in order to better gauge and quantify the use of censorship in the print media distribution chain. And the investigation which we at Reporters Without Borders allows us to study 28 cases of interference with the dissemination of information and to identify some major trend. And the first major trend, which is maybe not surprising, but I think it's worth mentioning, that actually the strongest influence on all levels and all stages of media distribution is actually coming from state authorities, mostly state authorities. They were involved in acts of obstructions that delay or block the dissemination of news and information. And the state interference, show our data in our survey which we did, may be exercised both via judicial institutions and the military, and not to forget in some countries by religious leaders, where actually religion and state are very closely linked. And more than 45% on all the interferences, all of the interference on this stage of those surveyed also blamed organized crime, oligarchs, intelligence agency, and angry citizens. A second chart with some figures is actually just highlighting which are the topics which actually make authorities or organizations to interfere in the media distribution chain. And what we see, so which is actually triggering the most frequent blocking or distribution, the subjects that are censored most during the distribution are, and this, I mean, perfectly fits to the first figures, are politics and business stories, and especially those involving corruption. Interestingly as well, nudity and erotic content trigger at least 6.5% of dissemination restrictions or banned. And I think these are some interesting figures. And the third chart with some figures are at what point in a newspaper's production does the censorship take place. And I think it's important to mention that still censorship of newspapers is prior to printing is the most common form of censorship, according to more than 60% of those polled in our survey. The risk of censorship, anyhow, during distribution is nonetheless significant. More than 22% of answers also cited censorship while newspapers are being delivered after leaving the printing presses, and 41% at the point of sales. And coming back again to a world map, because I started with our World Press Freedom Index, where actually we have a separate category actually on infrastructural factors for press freedom. But when it comes to serial censors, according to our data and our report, there are some countries, 5 countries, which are qualified as distributions serial censors. And here we are mixing up state interference, and even if we talk about organized crime in the case of Mexico, but these countries are India, Mexico, Rwanda, Russia, Belarus. These countries are really champions, if one can say so, in obstructing the dissemination of newspapers and magazines. They don't intervene at just one point in the distribution chain, but do so at multiple stages, so on all the 3 stages I mentioned, in order to secure complete control over what can and cannot be read. And this just brings me to one final very final remark. Very often we see that the risk of intervening on all 3 stages of media distribution is far more higher where we have a high concentration, where we have monopoly situations, where actually media distribution is very closely linked actually to power monopolies of states and media. And this brings me just to say thank you and recommending you to have a read in the report, which you can download on our website, globally on rsf.org, or in German on reporterohnegrenzen.de. And I wish you some interesting days here, and thank you very much.